Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's resolution defense webinar. Tonight we'll be discussing the NCFCA's policy resolution. Resolved, the United States federal government should substantially reform its policies towards the People's Republic of China. A couple things before we begin tonight. As you all noticed, please try and keep your comments and your chat between one another in the bottom right-hand chat box. That is there for you so that you can discuss with one another and chat. On the top right-hand box, that box is for questions that you would like to submit for tonight's resolution webinar. Without no further ado, we are going to welcome Mr. Doug Bandow. He's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. He specializes in foreign policy and civil liberties, and he has worked as a special assistant to President Ronald Reagan and an editor for magazine Inquiry. He also writes regularly for leading publications around the nation, such as Fortune magazine, National Interest, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Times. He's also appeared regularly on ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC as a commentator on foreign relations, and he holds a Juris Doctorate from Stanford University. We're really excited to have Doug with us here tonight, and please give him your attention. Hopefully he can help you guys prepare really well for your debate competitions. And without further ado, here is Doug Bandow.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Doug Bandow. I work with the Cato Institute in Washington. I'm a policy nerd. I saw somebody say they didn't really like policy. Well, that's kind of what I'm into. And that's kind of what this, I think, debate topic's really about. China is obviously a quite important issue. I think a very good issue for discussion and for debate topic. Where Asia has become really the most important region in the world. It's important economically. China's the #2 economic power. Japan's #3. India is moving up. Countries like South Korea are very important economically. So we look in the future, we see the economies there growing. And there are also a lot of security issues that come out of Asia, and China's involved in most of them. The territorial disputes throughout the region with Japan, Philippines, Vietnam, even India. North Korea gets a lot of attention. This is a country that's supported by China, but it has potential conflicts with the U.S. and with South Korea. It's building nuclear weapons, which we don't like. China's very involved in that. And there are a lot of other issues in the region where China plays one role or another. Burma, Thailand, it's having a bigger role. It's involved elsewhere in the region. And U.S. policy is treating Asia as being more important. That basically, from the standpoint of the U.S., the Obama administration talked about a pivot or a rebalancing towards Asia. The idea was we're going to try to emphasize Asia more. We're going to try to give more attention to Asia. And of course, the administration's had some problem with this because if you look around the world, the U.S. remains involved in wars in the Middle East. It remains very involved in Europe. It's confronting Russia. So it's been hard for the administration, where in theory at least, it's going to devote more attention to Asia. It's found that in practice, that's kind of hard. And this, I think, is a really fruitful area of discussion for the future. That in almost all of these issues, China is absolutely critical. And the question for the United States is, how do we deal with China, especially in coming years where the U.S. is going to be facing a lot of fiscal problems. They're not being talked a lot about in this election, but they really do matter, especially for you all. That 2016, for the first year in a number of years, the deficit went up, the federal deficit. Congressional Budget Office tells us that within 10 years, if there aren't changes, we'll have $1 trillion deficit every year. And 10, 20, 30 years after that, we're looking at debt to GDP ratios that kind of put us where Greece is. That we will owe more money, considering the size of our economy, than we did after World War II. So if that's the economic backdrop for us, the question then is, how do you deal with Asia as well as the rest of the world? This really is the challenge. Excuse me. And this is a problem for the U.S., and it's one which I don't think policymakers have thought nearly enough about. Now, if you think about Asia, these days Asia really is kind of China's the number one country. Other countries are important, but the focus is China. So the question for the United States, any engagement in Asia almost certainly has some impact or some relevance to engaging China. And it's a tough relationship. The Congressional Research Service recently warned that ties are becoming increasingly complex and often fraught with tension. So there's a concern about the U.S. relationship. We want a peaceful relationship, a diplomatic relationship, but it's not easy. And if you look at a lot of the issues today, can you use diplomacy, economics, politics? All of these things get very tough. Now, the People's Republic of China, as it styles itself, is an emerging power, clearly a great power. A lot of people talk about it as a potential hegemonic power. They talk about it as a potential equal of the United States. The only country out there that we kind of perceive that might challenge the U.S. on a global scale. The benefits of the relationship between the U.S. and China are significant. That is, economically, we're partners in many ways. We prosper together, but we're also competitors. We compete around the world in investment and trade, and a lot of security issues we have very different views. What to do about North Korea, what to do about all these territorial disputes, these things are very tough. The U.S. has been interested in China for more than 100 years. Back in the late 1800s, there were Americans who figured, gee, if I could only sell some toothpaste to every person in China, I'd be rich. There's always been this hope of dealing with China. China's history, if you look at it, it's very tumultuous. It's had wars, it's had conflict, revolution, foreign invasion. This is a country that's gone through quite a bit. Became a republic early in the 1900s, invaded by the Japanese, then a revolution by the communists. So the U.S. relationship with China has gone up and down based upon these other events. Very pro-China leading up to World War II, supporting China against Japan, but after the Communist Revolution, very little, worked together. Now that changed in 1972 when Richard Nixon kind of famously opened up to China, and a lot of that was geopolitics at the time. He wanted China as a counterweight to the Soviet Union, which luckily is gone now, but that was very much a geopolitical move, but it's also become an economic move. And what we see today is the U.S. and China are engaged in a lot of different treaties. They're engaged in negotiations. They're engaged in through the World Trade Organization. They have discussions about intellectual property. All of these things. We have trade disputes. U.S. law is applied. We file suits against them in the World Trade Organization. They file suits against us. It's become a presidential election issue. This happened 4 years ago, and it's also an issue this year. Donald Trump, for example, has talked about putting a 45% tariff on any products from China. So it's politically contentious as well as an important economic issue. The U.S. is also pushing very hard the TransPacific Partnership, which is a grouping of about 40% of the world's economic power, but it would not bring in China. And that's controversial. It would bring in countries like Japan, others in East Asia, and the question whether should China come in, what are the standards that should be applied. It's another one of these issues. The challenge here is that there's no doubt Americans benefit from lower production costs. Many of the things we buy, we save money on. If we save money, that means we spend less. It's particularly good for people of lower incomes. It means American companies, spend less. But then there's a concern about production. That is, if jobs go overseas, what happens to American workers? How much of that is China versus how much of that is general kind of productivity? That is, if you look at manufacturing Virtually every country on earth is losing manufacturing jobs. By one estimate, the jobs lost between 2000 and 2010, 90% will result basically of increased productivity. That is, we produce more. So we need fewer workers to produce as much stuff. Trying to separate how much is China, how much is productivity isn't easy. The other thing is that China has undercut other countries in the third world. So, if you get rid of Chinese products, that doesn't mean you stop buying cheaper products. You just may buy them from Vietnam, you might buy them from Laos, you might buy them from Burma. The U.S. has opened up recently a relationship with Burma. So all of these are potential challenges in looking at this relationship. The U.S., people focus on the trade deficit. In 1990, the U.S. ran about a $10 billion deficit. Last year the deficit was about $366 billion. That's the gap between exports and imports. We export a bit more services than they do, but they export a lot more merchandise, products, goods to us. In one sense, the trade deficit is an accounting fiction. There's no, it's not like the U.S. government gets that or doesn't get it. That's individuals buying and selling. And there are artificial aspects to it. An attorney called named Scott Lincecum has pointed out that the Apple iPhone, that's made in China, that basically China adds about $6 of value to it. It comes into the U.S. and it's a $300 add-on in terms of the deficit. That's really kind of artificial. Most of those benefits go to Apple, which is an American company. So what does that mean? And long term, China is potentially a very important growing market because it doesn't buy as much from us today because it's still poor. Big economy, but people there still are much poorer than America. It has about 4 times as many people as us, so when you look at their GDP numbers, you have to cut them basically by a fourth. And one thing the Chinese do is they buy U.S. debt. They own about $1.24 trillion of federal debt. That is, they help keep the interest rates lower. So that's a benefit to us. Some people worry, does that give them influence? But if they tried to dump all that debt, they'd lose their investment. The point is, for them, it's pretty hard to use that as an economic weapon. And unless you want to pay higher interest rates, it's nice to have somebody who buys all that stuff. There's also increasing Chinese investment in the U.S., about $30 billion worth this year. The challenge for that is we worry about security issues. Do we want them buying computer companies? Do we want them buying semiconductor companies? Do we want them, to run a port? So we have a review process. So the Chinese get mad because they say, well, you tell us you don't want this deficit and you won't let us buy things. And some of those get kind of political. There was a Chinese insurance company this year that wanted to buy Starwood hotels. It's hotels like Sheraton, and they gave up because of the criticism. Well, there's no security implication of that. Frankly, who cares who owns the hotel? So we have these investment issues where they may invest more, but then we worry about the security side. And there's current negotiations on this. This, again, is an area where diplomacy matters. We're talking about an investment treaty. The Chinese are talking about making promises about making an easier investment climate there. They have a lot of restrictions, far more restrictions than we do. We also have an issue of transfer of technology. The Chinese typically want investors to essentially give them their technology, transfer it over. There's also a lot of problems in terms of intellectual property protection. They have been estimated at different points of up to 80% of the violations of intellectual property. And they theoretically are doing better, but some people are afraid that really they view this as a way to quickly catch up with the West, which is grab our technology and use it and have it for their own benefit. We also run into the issue of cyber crimes. A lot of attacks, at least in the past, in terms of cyber war, cyber attacks have come from China. Now, last year, the President Obama and President Xi Jinping of China reached an agreement to kind of end any government support for commercial attacks. That seems to have had some effect. Today, frankly, we worry more, I think, from Russia, cyber attacks, and maybe even North Korea. Nevertheless, we all assume they're probably still mounting some, government involvement. We don't know. This is an area, again, how do you handle this? You don't want to go to war over this. Diplomacy has had some impact. What's the future? kind of agreements, threats, sanctions you might apply. These are very important issues for us. And when you look in overall kind of working together, there are a lot of different potential problems with the Chinese economy. We've been worried about the value of their currency, and it's been charged that they lower the value of their currency so they can export more. That was true a few years ago. It's not clearly true today, because now they're trying to turn their currency, the yuan, into kind of this global currency to challenge America. But one of our problems is we don't really know what the right value of the currency is. That you can use that to try to promote exports, but one of the problems is the more you assemble products, that is, you have intermediate products coming in, then it's not so clear it's good to have a cheap currency, because they have to buy things, put those into things they manufacture to send abroad. So if they have to spend more to import, then it costs them more to export. The other thing is no one really knows what the right value is. Last year, the International Monetary Fund declared that the yuan was no longer undervalued, just a month after the U.S. Treasury Department decided that it was significantly undervalued. Well, who was right? I don't know. Most economists probably don't know. So how do you deal with them in terms of their currency? I mean, we at times have kind of lowered our currency values. How do we deal with them if they do that for them? They're trying to have an increased role internationally on economics. They created their own group called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which we opposed and have not joined, but they moved ahead with a lot of American allies. We're worried about their economy overall. Still a very statist economy. That is, the government has a very large role. Back in 2011, it was estimated they had 144,000 state enterprises. Many of these we call zombie enterprises. They're essentially walking dead, right? They don't make any money. They're subsidized by the government. And people worry about their economy, exactly what's going on. People worry about debt. People worry about very high property bubble that they have, kind of like we had in 2008. The New York Times had a story today in China, and I'll just show this. We can't really see it, I guess, but it's a front-page story. In China, property frenzy, fake divorces, and a bloating bubble. I mean, these are issues that worry them. We think their economy is slowing down. A lot of people doubt they tell us the truth on their statistics. The question of the subsidies they give their groups. Uber just pulled out in the summer. It gave up basically facing a Chinese company that got Chinese government subsidies. All of these are issues the U.S. takes up with China because we want them to be fair. We want them to have a more kind of growing economy. We don't want them to subsidize their businesses. So all of these economic issues are both kind of private in the sense that we have American companies and individuals involved, but they're also public and they're diplomatic. The whole framework for our relationship is diplomatic, in terms of the World Trade Organization, trade agreements, investment agreement, negotiations over cyber warfare. All of these bring diplomacy into the area of economics, and all of these are going to be really big issues in the future, and it'll matter a lot in terms of the presidential election. I mean, either candidate's going to have to deal with these. Hillary Clinton in the past seen as more hawkish, and Donald Trump has been very critical on trade. These issues are going to be brought up with the Chinese. Beyond that, there are a lot of other issues with China. I mean, that it's a very complex society, and the relationship with the U.S. is very complex as well. I mean, one issue is human rights. This is a country that doesn't treat dissent well. There's been a real crackdown recently. The current president, Xi Jinping, has been talked about as the most powerful president since Mao Zedong, who died 40 years ago. I mean, he's very pushing, going after people for corruption. They've cracked down on universities cooperating with Americans. They've cracked down on U.S. consulate officials and others who I've talked to who used to work with Chinese. They have to be much more careful. I go there regularly, and you find people much more cautious. So there's a general attack on human rights lawyers, attacks on churches and things. So human rights is an issue that matters to America, and this is an issue which we talk about, and it comes up in negotiations. What happens there politically is also very interesting and has an impact on our relationship. President Xi is expected to get another term next year, But all of their politics is secret. Ours is in the open. Theirs is all secret. They're going to have a party Congress next year. They have to decide who's up and who's down. So there's a lot of speculation. And thought maybe President Xi would like to serve another term on top of that, which would break with tradition. So the politics there really will tell us who we're dealing with. You know, are they reformers? Are they hardliners? All of that matters a lot, you know, for the U.S. Big issue for the U.S. is security concerns. And here you get into the question of diplomacy and military action, alliances. So it's a mix of, well, when do you go use diplomacy? When do you use force? When do you send in your warships? When do you simply pick up the phone and call? You know, the PRC in China is well behind the U.S., but it is number 2 in the world on military spending. And what China is trying to do basically is not attack America, but they want to prevent the U.S. from intervening around them. We have 10, 11 carrier groups. They have one carrier, but they want to be able to sink our carriers. They don't want us to be able to intervene. If they get in a war, say, with Taiwan, or if they get in a war with Japan, they wouldn't want us involved. The real action there is not them threatening us. It's threatening American allies, particularly Japan and the Philippines, who have territorial disputes with them. They each have islands. Everybody claims them. China also has these disputes with countries like Vietnam. It also has disputes very separate with India. So these things don't matter directly with the U.S., but we're kind of brought in because we're allies of the Philippines, we're allies of Japan. If suddenly there'd be a war, we'd be brought into it. So then the question is, do we just take a diplomatic stance? Do we send in our warships? Do we promise to defend not just these countries that we're allied to, but do we promise to defend little pieces of rock here and there? The Scarborough Reef for the Philippines, Senkaku Islands for Japan. All of these are very difficult questions because they matter a lot more to China than they matter to us. So it can be very expensive and very risky, for us to want to go to war over those kinds of issues, especially if our allies, don't really spend as much on defense and want to drag us in and figure better to let, Uncle Sam over there take care of the problem than themselves. And beyond that, there are other issues we worry about. We worry about China throughout the Third World, its relationships with countries like Burma, Sudan, Zimbabwe, where it helps basic governments that we don't like, and especially its relationship with North Korea. This is a very complex issue. We'd like them to solve the problem, shut the North Koreans down. So far they won't. They don't want chaos on their doorstep, and frankly they don't want a united Korea allied with America and U.S. troops on their border. But these are areas that diplomacy at work, along with U.S. force. We have troops in Korea. We send in, the aircraft carriers, these sorts of things. We're just putting in a missile defense with South Korea. So all of these are issues that are out there that you can explore in terms of both, there's economic relationship most Americans care about, but these other things are very, very important. I mean, security in the years ahead, what's affordable, question of, how you try to get better human rights, can you promote democracy there, what happens with democracy there, it could be very nationalistic, we shouldn't have illusions. So my hope is that I've been able to kind of touch on at least a number of the areas, and I'm happy to take any questions from you all, and hopefully explore whatever you might be interested in hearing about. I see a couple questions here. Is space cooperation possible between the U.S. and China? Certainly. I mean, the U.S. cooperated with Russia. I mean, we even cooperated with them during the Cold War when they were the Soviet Union. Again, the challenge on a lot of these things is we want to work together, but then we're worried about the security side. We don't want them stealing technology. So I think that's the limiting factor. But the more you can cooperate, the better. I mean, in terms of having a better relationship, just think, we're better off in a world in which the two most important countries work together than are at each other's throats. Any historical U.S. policy failures towards China? Well, we can go back a long time. The U.S. tried to force its way into China back early 1900s. We were involved. We sent troops during the so-called Boxer Rebellion. We felt bad about that. We got indemnities from them. Actually, turned it into a scholarship fund. I'd say our policy, did not work very well early on. Our policy during the dealing with the communists probably didn't. We wouldn't talk to them for almost 30 years. That probably didn't help. We've had a lot of things that didn't work well there. Question of tariffs and WTO. The answer is yes. That if we imposed 45% tariffs, we'd be violating our obligations under the WTO. They could come and ask for penalties under the WTO. It makes no sense to sign an international agreement and then immediately violate it. So I would hope that if they want to respond to China some way, you have to find a legal way as opposed to something. And that, of course, would be a tax on Americans. That'd be a huge tax. How real is the risk of China stealing American technology? Well, it's definitely real. Private companies will talk about it. There are companies that have found either partnerships and stuff has essentially been stolen. It's clearly some of the cyber attacks. Again, how much was supported by the government, we don't know, but gave an advantage to Chinese companies. And the U.S. government basically threatened to put sanctions on those kind of companies, and that helped get the agreement with China. Relationship with Taiwan, that's extraordinarily important. It's one of the touchiest issues for the Chinese. My view is that Taiwan's been separate from China for essentially, it's more than a century, about 125 years, other than a few years after World War II. They should be viewed as independent. But most Chinese, including ethnic Chinese who don't live in China, view them as part of China. And there I find young students, college students, who don't like internet controls, very liberal in many ways, but very nationalistic. It's one of our hard issues. Are we prepared to go to war over that? No one wants war there. Taiwan has moved very far away from China. Most Taiwanese don't view themselves as Chinese. The current president is the former of the opposition party, has always been pro-independence. They now control the legislature. China's taken a hard line towards them. This is a really hard issue because if you want to maintain a strong relationship with Taiwan, provide arms, perhaps defend them, it's going to put you at odds with China, and this is not an easy one to resolve diplomatically because both sides are kind of dug in. It would be worth it to harm our relationship, in terms of Taiwan. Depends on how important you think it is. Are you prepared to go to war with the nuclear armed power? How far are you willing to put, military ships in? These are the issues we have to think about. What's important? What are we willing to take risks for? Is China poised to replace the U.S. largest economic power? Well, there's an argument. Economists use two different measures of GDP. One is exchange rate, and the other is purchasing power parity. That is, what do we think you can kind of get with the money you make? By some measures, people think their economy might be as big as ours, even now on that measure. But we're still far wealthier, far more technologically advanced. I think that over the long term, they could become bigger than us. That wouldn't surprise me. It's not clear to me they'll become more innovative than us. And the real problem is they have a lot of difficulties along the way. They are not yet an 800-pound gorilla. Some people talk about them growing old before they grow rich. They had this one-child policy. They recently got rid of it, but not that many people are having more kids. Well, what's happened there is that it has a very old population, rapidly aging, because you have this system where there's one person who has to take care of 2 parents and 4 grandparents. Doesn't work very well. There are also too many men, so it creates a problem in terms of marriage. So they have how that's going to work out, we don't know. We think that they lie about their growth numbers. They're growing, but not as fast as they say. They have lots of bad banks. They have what they call ghost cities. Essentially nobody's there. I've driven through one of them where it's kind of empty streets, big buildings, nobody walking around. All of these things could harm them for the future. They could have a collapse along the way, and economic problems give them political problems because the Communist Party doesn't have much legitimacy other than economic growth. If they stop growing, why should the communists be around? Does China hold undue leverage because of the debt? I don't think so. What would they do with the debt? They could sell it. Now, number one, there's still a lot of people around the world willing to buy it. The good news for us is for all of our economic problems, everybody else big seems to be worse. That is, the Europeans have economic problems, they have the euro problem, they have people leaving the European Union. So the dollar in America is viewed as safer than Europe. China, no one believes the numbers, there's no transparency. So if you're comparing where to invest, Japan hasn't grown for 20 or 30 years. So I actually don't think they have a lot of leverage. If they tried to dump all the debt and the price dropped, they'd hurt themselves. It's like, you have a hand grenade and you keep it, you hold on to it and say, I'm going to hurt everybody in the room, well, it hurts you too. I'm not too worried about that. How communistic is the current government? Well, it's not real communism. I mean, this is a communism where business people join. I mean, this is not, real communism. This is not Mao Zedong. I mean, his memorial is still in Tiananmen Square. If you ever go to China, you should go to it. It's a really, in my view, hysterical experience, this big marble statue, and his body, actually, we think it's probably wax, kind of laid out in this huge mausoleum. But, I mean, they're very cynical. I mean, all these people are incredibly corrupt. The last prime minister's family, I don't know, had $1 billion. I mean, they cracked down on all these. They have 100,000 party members under investigation for corruption. This is not kind of ideological communism. This is an authoritarian, almost fascist kind of dictatorship as opposed to genuine communism. What should the U.S. do in terms of human rights violations? Well, the problem is, we want to change people's human rights, but it's very hard to reach into other societies and do that, because the last thing other governments will do is kind of give up power. The last thing they'll do is give up their authority. So, and they also tend to dig in terms of kind of public, attacks. That is the whole sense of face. It's very hard if publicly I'm attacking you, your inclination is to say, no, absolutely not. The best thing we can do, I think, on human rights is typically behind the scenes push for specific steps and not make them public, but try to get them to do it and recognize it's going to be a slow process. Things like religious liberty is better today than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Churches operate. I mean, I was in Beijing and a couple of years ago, and the car to my left came to a stop, and on the bumper it had the traditional Christian fish. I mean, I've gone to church there. I have a good friend there. He's a Christian, and his wife is Christian. She's Chinese. I've gone to him to both Chinese and international congregations. There's progress. There's still people get arrested, bad things happen, but there is, I think, greater interest among a lot of the Chinese population for freedom. We want to foster that. We want to encourage that. It's not going to be easy, but sanctions, we have so many issues with them. You can't sanction them for everything. We're mad, what they do on North Korea. We're mad about Taiwan. We're mad, you can't really do everything. Let's see. Should we be concerned about cyber attacks? Absolutely. Again, the interesting thing here is that today we're far more worried about Russia than China. That suggests to me that diplomacy backed by threats of sanctions can work. Again, we need to have good defenses. Companies need to be good at defending themselves. Federal government has to do a better job of coordination. Let's see. It's hard to keep up with you all. I'm sorry. Let's see. Should we stop? We don't really should we stop foreign aid? We really don't give them foreign aid. I mean, they borrow money from some of the international organizations that we're members of. There's a good argument not to do that, for lots of reasons, not to do with China. I think it probably made sense not to join their new bank, but they got some political credibility out of it. How could we aid their fight against pollution? I mean, pollution's really awful there. If you go at the wrong time, I mean, it's pitiful. They have huge traffic jams in the big cities like Beijing. The best thing we might be able to do conceivably is to help transfer some technology to them, but then again, they're probably wealthy enough to pay for it. What would be best for them is to have more democracy, because when people are able to express themselves, they typically say, I want better air, I want better water quality. That's started to have an impact there. They know they have a problem. They're part of international agreements. Again, I think that's, as they grow wealthier, that problem gets easier because they have more money. They can deal with additional problems. Let's see, how can we promote democracy there? Again, the best thing we can do, frankly, is engage. That is, the more Americans who visit, the more we have contact with them. the current president over there doesn't like that. To me, that's a good example of, that tells us that it's why we should keep doing it. That is, the more university contacts. I go over and speak at a university there every summer. I've done that 6 years in a row, meeting students, being involved. That's the kind of subversion, trying to get literature over there, trying to bring Chinese students studying in America. I think is a good thing. They see America, they meet Americans, they gain American friendships. A lot of them want to stay here. A lot of them would like to go elsewhere in the world. They bring different ideas back. I think that's one of the things we can do. How much in debt would we go? You don't even want to contemplate war with China. I mean, we could defeat them if it's simply ship to ship in the Pacific. But what does it mean to go to war with them? It's a huge country, and they have nuclear weapons. We have a better nuclear force. But the last thing you want to do is think about, because even if they lost this time, they're going to come back. To me, consider historically, Great Britain was the great power, and then two powers arose, the United States and Germany. Britain decided to accommodate America, because it kind of accepted, okay, we can't keep a bigger navy than them, we're going to have to make border concessions. They made America their friend. Germany they confronted, and they had 2 world wars before everything got sorted out. So my view is that in dealing with China, we want to figure it out without those world wars. It might not be easy, but you don't want to even contemplate that. Let's see. Taiwan is completely independent. His question was, what's the relationship? Taiwan is effectively an independent country. It has about 23 countries that recognize it as independent. What it is international organizations do not. It's not part of the United Nations. The U.S. does not formally recognize them. We have an American institute in Taiwan, which acts like an embassy but is not. And they have a legation, they have a group, excuse me, here in Washington, which does the same. It's called TECRO. It's the Taiwan Economic Cooperation and something or other Council or something, whatever. So it's kind of a lot of countries do that, because you can get visas, you can go visit them. So China has no control, but they have a lot of economics back and forth. A lot of Taiwanese investment in China, a lot more Chinese are investing in Taiwan and visiting Taiwan. So those economic ties are very close and scare some Taiwanese who don't want to be absorbed by China. Now, tariffs I don't think are good. Tariffs, excuse me, tariffs cost us. Basically a tariff is a tax on you. So the question is, would you like to have to pay more for goods that if you get them more cheaply, your life is better, and if companies buy things more cheaply, they can better compete. That is, a car company wants cheaper steel. So our challenge here is, you put tariffs on steel, you help the steel industry, but you hurt the car industry. So tariffs are almost always, a group is out there saying help us, but usually Americans overall are worse off. Could there be war between Japan and China? Actually, yes. It's kind of scary. They're arguing over the Senkaku Islands. The Chinese call them the Diaoyu Islands. They're like 5 pieces of rock that nobody lives on. These things matter because today, under the law of the Sea Treaty, basically, if you own a piece of real estate in the water, you get the fishing resources around it, and you get all the hydrocarbons, that is oil and natural gas underneath. So suddenly everybody wants to own this stuff. For many years they didn't really care, and Japan owns them, at least has them. China claims them. They're both kind of sending in their ships and sending their planes in. We've seen the same thing with the Philippines and Scarborough Reef, which is controlled by the Philippines, but then China came in and took some stuff, and their ships go back and forth. So these things, you could imagine, we joke about a drunken sea captain, right? I mean, somebody who shows up and rams another ship, and suddenly the other side sends in their ships, and somebody sends in some planes, and somebody decides to go start shooting. Boy, it could get really ugly. So, these things are very, very dangerous, and we're brought in because we have alliances. That is, we're supposed to protect the Philippines and Japan. What specifically would we do? We haven't really spelled out, but it matters a lot to us. Freedom of navigation missions, have those been good? Well, the U.S. cares a lot about navigation. The challenge, of course, is to some degree, it's not just us, but the other side responds. That is, the more we send in our ships, we kind of send a message to China that they have to be better able to stop us from sending in our ships. So it's kind of a yes and no. We want them to know that we want freedom of navigation, to the extent that they perceive we're threatening them militarily, they're much more likely to respond militarily. I tell people, you got to flip this around. Imagine if the Chinese were sending ships up the eastern seaboard and in the Caribbean. The Chinese were telling us about our relations with Cuba, and the Chinese in Beijing were talking about war with America. Americans probably would not say, oh, let's give up. We'd say, let's build ships and missiles and make sure these people can't hurt us. I think we have to take that into account when you start thinking about what do we do. They are going to respond, and we may not like the response. It may be a very different response than we wanted. Let's see. What's my opinion of the South China Sea? The thing about China, the South China Sea, is all of these islands are different. They're Paracel Islands. They're the Spratly Islands. And they're separate from, you go north with Japan. There are some disputes even between South Korea and Japan. And then Brunei and some other countries claim things. My general view is that for the most part, Chinese claims aren't very good. I mean, they're not stupid, but they're not particularly good. I think their best claim may be the Senkaku Islands. But their view is, frankly, they spent a couple of 100 years under Western domination. They were isolated and didn't have the strongest military under the real communist rule, Mao. So now is their time to assert themselves. So we have to decide to what extent do you try to find ways to accommodate, maybe shared sovereignty, shared resource development, and to what extent are you prepared to confront them and say, no, absolutely not, you don't get any of this. And that is not an easy decision, but again, to some degree it matters a lot more to them than us, and that's what makes it challenging. Okay, I've asked of being on a panel regarding China on North Korea. Yes, I've written about that a lot. Look, the problem with, to some degree, what we do is we go to China and we tell China what we want. And so we want China to help us on North Korea. And my reaction, if I was sitting in Beijing, is I'd say, are you nuts? Because, again, look at it from China's standpoint. China sees the U.S. as trying to basically contain it. The U.S. has bases all along China. The U.S. is allied with South Korea, allied with Japan, allied with the Philippines, allied with Taiwan, allied with Australia, allied with, from their standpoint, it looks like we're trying to really contain them and not let them do anything. So why would they want to give up their one? They really is their only military ally of any seriousness, North Korea. I mean, it's not a nice ally, but it's kind of the only one. And basically have a united Korea with American troops there. From this, and also to try to stop North Korea, if they stop providing food and energy, which is the best thing they could do, they don't want to have that country come apart. I mean, the worst thing that could happen would be to have basically that system fall apart. So, imagine chaos on their border. The Yalu River isn't that wide. It's really not that hard to get across. So if North Korea fell apart, millions of refugees, etc. So my view is that what we have to do is simply go to China and say, look, we understand why you don't want to help us, so how about if and then we need to offer them something. And that means saying we'd help pay the cost of refugees. It means saying there'd be no U.S. troops there in united Korea. I mean, it means that kind of a thing. So I think it's possible, but only, again, diplomacy. You have to convince them. You can't tell them. You got to convince them. Let's see. China's need for expansion for its populations. Well, it does. Its population is stabilizing. I mean, one of the impact of the one-child policy, has really created this kind of very weird demographic cliff. That even though they've changed that, they dropped the one-child policy, you haven't seen much increase. So it's not clearly going to have a massively expanding population in the future. The place where that probably matters most is Siberia, and it really worries the Russians. The Russians have, 2 or 3 million people living in this vast territory, and there are hundreds of millions of Chinese, just south. So that's an issue actually probably for Russia as opposed to us. Let's see. We make our defenses stronger against, hacking. Well, I mean, we want good cybersecurity against anyone. And as I think I mentioned, at the moment, Russia's probably doing more than China. I mean, the evidence is China is down. Now, of course, they may be doing it more secretively and more effectively, but the anti-hacking organizations that have looked at this generally say evidence is it's down. So it would appear that the Chinese government at least has backed off some. So I think the answer is American companies have to do better because they're the first line of defense. And they have to be prepared, not only China, but North Korea, which hacked Studio, and Russia. And you also need the U.S. government. And one of the things the U.S. government could do is change the law and allow American companies essentially to hack back. It's against the law to hack back and try to take the information back that was stolen from you, or to retaliate. But we want to make that legal. It makes sense to allow American companies to do that. So there are some things that we definitely could do to help our defenses. Is it economically feasible to punish Chinese companies with sanctions for human rights violations, hacking? Well, you've got to choose your target. See, the problem here from our standpoint is China. There are a lot of things we want from China. We would like China not to start a war over the Senkaku Islands. We would like China not to start a war over Taiwan. We would like China to put pressure on North Korea. We would like China to stop stealing intellectual property. We would like China to do better on human rights. We would like China to treat people in Hong Kong better. It's a long list, but you can't sanction them on everything. And the problem is, if you don't choose a few targets and emphasize them, then essentially you're not choosing anything. And that's our problem, is what's most important. Do we want to change their currency policy? Do we want to change their policy in terms of export? Do we want to change their policy in allowing American investment? Well, you can't hit them on everything. You've got to decide what's your foremost interest, what's your priority. And that, I think, is the challenge. Choose your priorities and then come up with a strategy. If you want to do everything, you're not going to get anything out of them, because they're going to just say, oh, go jump. You want us to do all that? Come on. We would never do that if they came to us with an agenda like that. They're going to respond much the same way. Should we allow Chinese companies to invest in U.S. nuclear plants? Do Chinese citizens own a large portion of U.S. property? There are a few. There's investment in the United States is in the thousands of companies. It's not huge. We're not talking about anything close to, say, what the Dutch own or the Japanese own or the Germans own or others. So the amount of investment in the U.S. is not huge, but it's advantageous, certainly going to areas without any security implications. Nuclear power plants, you could argue we shouldn't do it. That, again, what's critical infrastructure? What do we worry about them in terms of potentially trying to shut down if there was a conflict? I think you've got to choose carefully. That's one you might want to put on a list. I don't think you want to put a hotel on the list, but certainly nuclear power plants is a different kind of thing. That might make sense then to say, look, that's just going to be an area off limits. Let's see. Conflict. The U.S.'s recognition of the one China policy. This is very practical. This is simply practical. Is we want to deal with the big China, which has nuclear weapons, all the big economic strength, and is the power player in East Asia. So we recognize there's one China, while in practice we act as if there are two. We just don't call the other China officially a country. It's not fair to Taiwan. Taiwan's a wonderful place, much freer, it's democratic, it's really capitalist, it doesn't have a lot of the controls that China does. But you've got to ask yourself, are you willing to go to war over that? Because for China, this is emotional. Ethnic Chinese outside of China say Taiwan's part of China. College students I talk to uniformly tell me Taiwan is part of China. So this is not an issue of kind of liberal conservative. This is just, in China, very, very common. So you've got to decide what you're willing to go to war for. You've got to decide how much price you're willing to pay. You can decide Taiwan's worth that, but don't have any illusions that it's going to be a cakewalk, that everything will be fine, and don't assume the Chinese will back down. The Chinese perspective is America would never risk Los Angeles to protect Taipei. And, there's an argument we shouldn't. So that's the problem dealing with Taiwan, is how important is it? What are you willing to do about it? Let's see. Advantages about U.S. adoption in China. I have a friend who has two ethnic Chinese kids. She adopted in China. It's great for kids. I think that's one of those issues that changes the more Chinese society changes. The wealthier it becomes, the more they can take care of people who are poor. But it's certainly been helpful to kids in the past. What is Taiwan's view of the one China policy? Typically, the KMT, the Kuomintang, accepted that. The DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party that's now in power, has not. And President Xi has not accepted that, and that is why China is at the moment refusing to talk to them. So it's a point of very real contention today. Should the U.S. join the AIIB? My view is we don't have to be a member of everything. We throw money at all these things. World Bank, IMF, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. We really don't have to join another one. Should we be concerned about strengthening the relationship between Russia and China? Very good question. The great kind of the incredible Nixon initiative in '72 was to further the split between China and Russia. Geopolitically, it was brilliant. What we're doing now is reversing that, and we're pushing China and Russia together. That's very stupid. They have a lot of things that don't get along in certain ways. The Chinese steal Russian technology as well as ours. The Russians have sold them arms, and the Chinese have reverse engineered them. Russia's worried about Siberia. I mentioned that. China's doing better investment-wise in Central Asia over Russia, which Russia is viewed as its own area. So we should be accentuating that split, encouraging it. We shouldn't be pushing them together. Should the U.S. require Chinese business to get a license and have, trademark products? Well, it certainly is worthwhile trying to protect intellectual property. Americans gain a lot from that. China's been a major offender. They are not as bad as they once were. Again, this is one of those issues of, how much do you spend? How does it fit? What's more important? IP, trade, currency value, how much they subsidize their industries. We have to pick our targets, and what's the best way to achieve them. The question is, well, how do you get IP enforcement? We've gotten them to agree to things. Now we have to get them to enforce them, and that's somewhat hard. Let's see. U.S. not agree to some. Well, look. Okay. Let's see. Why do we complain if they subsidize and we don't? Oh, come on. You actually think politicians are going to be consistent? Oh my. I mean, no. Of course, the U.S. weakens its currency when it wants. The U.S. subsidizes its industry when it wants. The U.S. does all sorts of things and then gets upset if other countries do the same. But it's not in the interest of us to have them subsidizing their industry, in making American companies less competitive. It's really not in their own citizens' interest. So that's why we talk about it. But you're right. There's a lot of hypocrisy in any international relationship. Let's see. What we've tried to do, say, with Europe on, with the Export-Import Bank, is to say, okay, we reduce the amount of subsidies. So we might come to that agreement with China. Let's see, why communique is in place, is working, end arms sales. Well, the question of Taiwan, again, is one way that you can help Taiwan is you might say, we're not going to defend you. We don't want to get in a war, but we'll sell you weapons. So if you can make it clear to the Chinese that they would pay a very high price if they tried anything against you. So, I think that's one way. That's one way to kind of compromise. And you say, we're going to still sell arms. We just don't want to be involved directly in a war. Let's see. Substantially, okay, some of these I've seen before. Let's see. Does China meet requirements for most favored nation status? It got that basically through the WTO. What we're talking about now is whether we declare them to be a market economy. We have refused to do so, and frankly, for good reason. Again, lots of state enterprises, actually greater subsidies today than a few years ago. So again, this is an area of negotiation. We want them to do certain things before we do that. U.S.-China relations getting better or worse? Probably worse. Recently. Again, what's your time frame? Better than 40 years ago. Worse than 3 or 4 years ago. Does China view North Korea's advanced nuclear weapons as a threat? That might be our last one. The answer is not directly, but they view North Korea as a problem. It's unstable. It causes trouble. They worry about it falling apart. So they would prefer not have nuclear weapons. And I thank you. I think, okay, 2 more questions, I'm told. Let's see. Embargo on Chinese arms still needed. Well, it depends on if you think there's a chance of going to war with China. I hate to arm them and then have to fight them, and we've got Europe, an arms embargo for the same reason. I think there's a good reason for that. What sanctions do we have on China now? Are they working? We don't really have direct sanctions on China. We have indirect, like sanctions on, say, banking with North Korea can affect Chinese banks, but we don't sanction them directly. That you're taking on the second economic power on earth, that'd be a big deal. So you want to think about that carefully. So thank you very much. I've enjoyed being on.
Well, it looks like my my video isn't working right now, but we appreciate Doug for joining us today and answering as many questions as he could for you guys. We also hope that you felt and that this was a great experience to help you guys with your debate resolution preparation. And we hope that you would go on and complete our student survey. If you're a teacher, also we have a teacher survey to let us know what we can do better and how we can make this experience better for you in the future. And also, we have a second NCFCA webinar next Monday night, so please go sign up and join us for that. And then if you have any questions, we'll stay on for a minute and answer what we can. We won't be able to answer any policy questions, but we can answer any questions about future webinars and other Bill of Rights Institute programs that we offer. And you can also go to our www.billofrightsinstitute.org/engage to find out more information. So please take some time to do that as well. Again, we thank you for your time this night. We hope that your school year is going well, that you're having a wonderful year, and yes, please take our surveys, and we will talk to you later.